cosmic dust, swirled in the cradle of new stars. The endless labyrinths of our memory, woven from electrical impulses. Digital universes, born from pure code. 3 worlds, each reflecting the same eternal quest. For centuries, humanity has drawn maps of paradise, depicting rivers of bliss and cities of light, relying on faith and ancient legends. But what if we've been looking in the wrong places all this time? What if the real map isn't ancient parchment, but the electroencephalogram of a dying brain? And what if science already has its own coordinates? Today, we are heading into the most forbidden territory, beyond life. Our guide will be not faith, but the rigorous scientific method. Where is this paradise from the perspective of physics, neurobiology, and quantum mechanics? The answer may shock you. To find the coordinates of paradise, scientists started not with telescopes, but with stethoscopes. The first reports of journeys beyond came not from astronomers, but from emergency room physicians. Stories of those who have been there, where the heart stops and breathing ceases, but for some reason consciousness does not. These stories, collected bit by bit from all over the world, are known as near-death experiences, and they are the starting point of our investigation. This phenomenon was first systematized by Dr. Raymond Moody. He listened to hundreds of people who had returned from the dead and discovered frightening similarities. Almost all of them described the same thing: the sensation of leaving one's own body, a swift flight through a dark tunnel towards a blinding light, a meeting with deceased loved ones, and an all-encompassing feeling of peace and love. It sounds like a script written from scratch. But what if it's not a script, but a description of a real place? For a long time, science dismissed these stories, attributing everything to death throes and oxygen deprivation. A convenient, simple explanation. It worked, until someone who had spent his life studying the brain looked beyond the boundaries. Someone who knew for sure that such a thing was impossible. Meet Dr. Eben Alexander, Harvard neurosurgeon, a man of science to the core, for whom consciousness was nothing more than a product of biochemical processes in gray matter. He believed that the brain generates intelligence the same way a generator generates electricity. Turn off the generator, and the light goes out. End of story. Until one day, his own generator failed. In 2008, a rare form of bacterial meningitis literally dissolved his neocortex, the part of his brain responsible for thought, emotion, and memory. Everything that made him human. For 7 days he lay in a coma, with no activity in his higher brain regions. From a neurosurgical perspective, Eben Alexander no longer existed. Inside his skull there was only a biological mass, incapable of dreaming, let alone experiencing complex emotions. But he survived. And what he told me turned his world upside down and challenged all of modern science. His journey began not in paradise, but in a primitive, filthy world he called the world of the worm's eye. He felt like a point of consciousness in a murky, gelatinous environment, surrounded by grotesque faces and a rhythmic, dull thud. There was no memory, no body, only primal terror. And then there was light and music. The light unfolded into a portal, and a melody of incredible beauty poured out. It pulled him out of the mud and into a completely different reality. He flew over a lush green valley filled with shining creatures and waterfalls cascading into crystal lakes. He was not alone. He rode on the wing of a giant butterfly, and next to him was a girl with radiant blue eyes. She didn't speak, but he received her thoughts instantly, like a single block of information. And the message was simple. You are loved and valued. You have nothing to fear. We will show you many things here, but in the end, you will return. Above this world, he sensed the presence of an omnipotent, omniscient source of light, a divine core that radiated absolute, unconditional love. The experience was, in his words, hyper-real, more real than life itself. When Alexander miraculously emerged from his coma and told his story, his fellow doctors were polite but adamant. It was a complex hallucination, a fantasy created by a dying brain. But there was one detail that didn't fit into this neat theory. His neocortex was completely shut down, destroyed by bacteria. There was simply nothing there to hallucinate. How can a brain that doesn't function create an experience more real than reality itself? How could a man with no memory see the face of a girl he never knew, but later, looking at an old photo, recognize her as his biological sister who had died many years ago? The story of Eben Alexander is the central conflict of our investigation. On the one hand, there is the subjective experience of a man, confirmed by medical data about his brain's inactivity. On the other, there is the fundamental law of neuroscience. No brain, no consciousness. So what was this? A genuine breakthrough beyond matter? Proof of the existence of heaven? Or are we simply underestimating what our minds are capable of in the final moments of life? Perhaps this is merely a grand farewell show the brain puts on for itself before turning off the lights forever. To answer this question, we must peer into the very center of this performance, into the theater of the dying brain. Stories like Eben Alexander's are spine-tingling, a journey into a world of light and unconditional love, an encounter with that which lies beyond our understanding. The experience feels utterly real, so real that it makes us question everything we know about life and death. And it is here, at the apex of this mystical mystery, that science shines its cold, bright light and offers a completely new perspective. What if this incredible journey took place not outside the body, but in the most complex and mysterious universe we know, inside the skull? What if heaven is not a place, but a grand final performance, staged for us by our own brains in their final moments? Welcome to the theater of the dying brain. To understand how this performance is staged, you need to know its mastermind. His name is hypoxia, oxygen starvation. When the heart stops, the oxygen supply to the brain is cut off. But the brain doesn't switch off instantly, like a light bulb. It begins to fade, and this process isn't silence, but a deafening storm. Neurons, deprived of energy, begin to discharge chaotically and erratically. And the first to suffer in this storm are the most energy-consuming parts. Recall the most common image from eyewitness accounts, the tunnel with a light at the end. From a neurobiological perspective, this is not a portal to another world, but a direct consequence of the fading of the visual cortex. Our peripheral vision, responsible for the edges of our field of vision, is the first to fail. Central vision, the sharpest, holds on until the very end. The result? The field of vision narrows, leaving only a bright spot in the center, which we perceive as the light at the end of the tunnel. The first act of our play is over. But what about the feeling of universal peace, bliss, and love, described by absolutely everyone who has experienced something similar? Is this, too, just chemistry? Exactly. In response to the colossal stress and pain of dying, the brain releases a veritable cocktail of powerful neurochemicals into the bloodstream. The main component of this cocktail is endorphins. These are our internal opiates, tens of times more effective than morphine. They instantly block pain and induce a powerful euphoria. That feeling of leaving the suffering body, of floating, and absolute peace. It's a biochemical anesthesia, the brain's final favor to its fading consciousness. Okay, we've explained the tunnel and bliss, but what about the most difficult part? Meetings with deceased relatives, angels, radiant beings. How can the brain generate such vivid, lucid, and complex visions? Here comes the third, most enigmatic actor, our own psychedelic. Scientists speculate that in extreme states, including death, our brain can produce dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. It's one of the most powerful hallucinogens known to man, known as the spirit molecule. Its effects are strikingly similar to descriptions of near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, journeys through unimaginable worlds, and encounters with entities. At the moment of death, the brain, trying to survive, can activate ancient mechanisms and trigger the production of DMT. And then the real show begins. Deep regions of the brain responsible for memory, emotion, and facial recognition, such as the temporal lobe, hippocampus, and amygdala, become hyperactive. In a desperate attempt to make sense of what's happening, the brain begins to pull the most significant images from its archives. The face of a beloved grandmother, the feeling of parental care, images from religious texts and children's fairy tales. It mixes them, compiles them, and projects them onto the internal screen of our consciousness, creating a hyper-realistic simulation of the afterlife. This is not an encounter with the souls of the dead. It is an encounter with our own deepest and most vivid memories. So, let's put it all together. Cardiac arrest. Hypoxia narrows vision to a tunnel vision. A powerful release of endorphins creates a feeling of bliss and separation from the body. Activation of the temporal lobes and the possible synthesis of DMT creates the most vivid hallucinations, woven from our own memories and hopes. It all seems to fit together. Every detail of the mystical experience finds its cold, rational explanation in biochemistry. Paradise is simply a protective protocol, the last program our onboard computer runs before a complete shutdown. It's an elegant and, frankly, very convincing theory. It explains practically everything. And that would be the end of it. The mystery solved. If not for one but, a small, inconvenient detail that ruins this entire coherent picture. Stories of people who, during clinical death, saw things they absolutely should not have seen. Details that couldn't be dismissed as hallucinations because they turned out to be true. Stories of a witness who shouldn't have been there. It would seem simple. The mystery solved. Theatre of the dying brain. An elegant and frighteningly logical explanation. Hypoxia, causing euphoria and a tunnel of light. A cocktail of endorphins, bestowing a feeling of all-encompassing bliss and love. A chemical storm that paints a farewell spectacle before the fading consciousness, woven from scraps of memory and cultural codes. Science seems to have put everything in its place. Paradise is a grandiose but merely biochemical illusion. Period. But what if I told you that's not the end of the story? That in this harmonious and logical edifice of neurobiology, there's a single crack that threatens to bring the entire structure down. In medical archives around the world, in the reports of resuscitation specialists and cardiac surgeons, evidence is accumulating that science long preferred to ignore. Eyewitness accounts that shouldn't have existed. We're talking about so-called verifiable or veridical near-death experiences. These aren't just subjective accounts of light and encounters with family. These are reports that contain verifiable facts, details that a person in a state of clinical death couldn't have known, couldn't have seen, and couldn't have heard. Imagine a patient on the operating table. The monitor's siren merges into one continuous sound. The heart has stopped. The brain, deprived of blood flow, ceases its higher activity within seconds. The electroencephalogram, recording cortical activity, flattens out. For doctors, this is the point of no return, beyond which comes a fight for every second of life. And so, after successful resuscitation, this man comes to and talks, not about the tunnel, but about a nurse in the far corner of the operating room dropping a glass ampoule. He describes precisely the dentures that a nurse removed from his mouth and placed on a special cart when resuscitation began. A detail he saw even though he could no longer see. He can recount verbatim the cynical joke the anesthesiologists exchanged over his lifeless body, certain no one could hear them. Stop and consider this paradox. These can't be memories, because memories are recorded and stored in the brain. But the brain was turned off at that moment. These aren't auditory hallucinations caused by a lack of oxygen. A person in cardiac arrest can't hear in the usual sense. And even more so, he can't see what's happening in the room because his eyes are closed and his body is motionless. How? How could information from the outside world, critical, clear, detailed, enter consciousness if its primary receiver and processor, the brain, was not functioning? This is the central question that breaks down simple neurochemical theory. It perfectly explains internal experiences, light, euphoria, a sense of peace, but it is completely powerless in the face of external, verifiable facts. These are not just isolated anecdotes. Scientists like Dr. Sampania have been studying this phenomenon for years in rigorous clinical settings. In his famous AWARE study, he and his team placed special images on tall cabinets in intensive care units, visible only from above, from the ceiling. The idea was simple. If a patient who had survived cardiac arrest reported floating above their body, they could be asked, "What did you see on the cabinet?" And while capturing such a hit-the-target case proved incredibly difficult, the study itself confirmed the main point. Consciousness, clear, thinking, and capable of perception, can exist even when the brain, by all medical indications, is no longer functioning.
Parnia himself calls this a fundamental paradox. Meaningful conscious experience occurs when the brain is in a state comparable to a coma or deep anesthesia. It's like claiming that your turned-off laptop, with its battery removed and screen blank, not only continued playing a movie, but also recorded every conversation in the room on its hard drive. Absurd? From a classical biological perspective, certainly. But the facts are stubborn. These witnesses that shouldn't be challenge the very foundation of our understanding of reality. They force us to ask an uncomfortable, almost heretical question for a materialist. What if consciousness isn't simply a product of the brain? What if the brain isn't the generator of consciousness, but rather its receiver? A complex biochemical transceiver that picks up some kind of broadcast from the outside. And when this receiver breaks down, for a few eerie moments, the etheric static disappears, and we hear something else. If we consider this shocking possibility even for a second, our entire worldview is turned upside down. Paradise is not an illusion of a dying brain. It is something else. But what? If consciousness is not born in the tangled web of neural networks, then what is its true nature? Where does it reside? To try to find the answer, we will have to descend from the level of biology to the most fundamental level of reality, to the place where the laws of probability and non-local connections reign, to the strange and wonderful world of quantum physics. Perhaps it is there, in the microscopic structures of our own neurons, that the key to the greatest mystery lies. The quantum ghost in the machine. So, we stand before a war. On one side, witnesses who see what they should not see. People with stopped hearts and silent brains who return with astonishingly precise details from our physical world. On the other side, a seemingly unbreakable law of biology. No brain activity, no consciousness. The theater of biochemistry we discussed earlier cannot explain these impossible witnesses. It collapses under the weight of the facts. What if we're trying to solve this mystery with the wrong tools? What if we, like people before the invention of the microscope, are trying to understand the nature of disease by looking at the world with only the naked eye? To go further, we must descend to a lower level, deeper than biology, deeper than chemistry. We must enter a world where the rules of our familiar reality cease to apply. The world of quantum physics. Sound complicated? Perhaps. But it is here, at the most fundamental level of existence, that two outstanding scientists have proposed a hypothesis that could revolutionize our understanding of absolutely everything. Meet Sir Roger Penrose, a Nobel Prize-winning mathematical physicist who worked side by side with Stephen Hawking, and Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist, a physician who, every day, turns human consciousness on and off in his practice. Together, they created a theory so bold that most neuroscientists still consider it scientific heresy. It's called OR, or Orchestrated Objective Reduction Theory. Let's put aside the complicated terminology and try to understand the essence. Throughout its history, science has considered the brain an incredibly complex, yet still biological computer. Neurons are wires, synapses are transistors, and consciousness is simply the result of this wet processor, a product, an illusion, a song sung by the brain. But Penrose and Hameroff asked, what if it's the other way around? What if consciousness isn't a product of the brain,
but a fundamental property of the universe itself, which the brain merely captures and processes, like a television, which doesn't create a broadcast, but only receives a signal. Where is this antenna in our head? The answer turned out to be even more shocking. Inside each of our 100 billion neurons are tiny protein structures called microtubules. Previously, scientists thought these were simply the skeleton of the cell, its framework. But Penrose and Hameroff proposed that it is something immeasurably more. These are the processors of a quantum computer. It is in these microtubules at the subatomic level that the magic happens. Information there exists not as the usual ones and zeros, but in a state of quantum superposition, in all possible variations simultaneously. And it is this infinitely complex orchestrated quantum process that we experience as our I, our consciousness. And now the most important thing. What happens at the moment of death? When biological processes in the brain stop, when the heart stops beating and blood no longer nourishes the neurons, the quantum computer loses its power. It can no longer maintain information in an ordered state. And then, according to Ork-Or theory, something incredible happens. The quantum information that makes up our personality, our consciousness, does not disappear. It cannot be destroyed. Such is the law of conservation of information. It is simply released. Leaks from the decaying biological machine and dissipates into the very fabric of space-time. Think about it. The tunnel of light reported by near-death experiences. Could this be the subjective experience of this leak process? A sense of oneness with all that exists, a loss of awareness of one's own body, a merging with the universe. Could this not be an accurate description of the state when your consciousness, your essence, is freed from physical shackles and becomes part of the cosmos? In this model, heaven is not a place at all. It has no coordinates on a map. It is not another planet or a parallel dimension. Heaven is a fundamental change of state, a transition from localized consciousness, confined to the body, to universal, non-local consciousness, existing outside of time and space. You don't go to heaven, you become it. This theory also elegantly explains the phenomenon of re-entry. If resuscitation efforts are successful and the brain begins to function again, quantum information can collapse back into the microtubules, and the person comes to his senses, carrying with him vague, fragmentary memories of what it was like to be part of everything. Memories that we call near-death experiences. Yes, this hypothesis is just that. It is at the cutting edge of science and is disputed by many. But it is one of the few that dares to answer the question of the impossible witness. It suggests that consciousness can exist, even for a moment, separately from the body, receiving information directly from the environment, like a quantum ghost in a biological machine. But this idea gives rise to a new, even more disturbing and, at the same time, fascinating question. If our consciousness is, in essence, highly complex information, then does it necessarily exist in a biological medium? If it can be uploaded into space, then couldn't it be uploaded somewhere else? What if we ourselves could build a new home for our consciousness, an eternal home, a man-made paradise? Let's leave quantum fields for a moment and look into the laboratories,
where an entirely different concept of eternity is being born. We have considered paradise as a biochemical theater and as a fundamental property of the universe. But what if we are asking the wrong question? What if paradise doesn't need to be sought? What if it needs to be built? This brings us to the most audacious idea ever conceived by the human mind: digital immortality. A concept that moves the afterlife from the realm of theology to the realm of information technology. The idea is simple at its core, but monstrously complex in its execution. If your consciousness, your memories, your personality are merely a unique pattern of electrochemical signals in the neural network of your brain, then what's stopping this pattern from being copied? Imagine for a moment. Your brain is nothing more than a biological, wet computer, an incredibly complex one, but still a computer. And your eye is its operating system and all the files accumulated over a lifetime. The Digital Immortality Project, or mind uploading, suggests that one day we will be able to conduct a complete scan of this structure, each of its 86 billion neurons, and the hundreds of trillions of connections between them. We will be able to create a comprehensive map, a connectome, and transfer it to another non-biological medium, a super-powerful quantum computer capable of simulating the entire brain in real time. What does that mean? This means that after the death of your physical body, your personality will continue to exist as pure code, but not just as an archive file. It will live, think, feel, and evolve within a boundless simulation. This is a digital Eden, a world where the laws of physics can be rewritten, where you can regain your youth, meet digital copies of departed loved ones, explore fictional worlds, or relive the best moments of your life. An eternity designed and built with our own hands. A paradise that doesn't wait for us, but one we create ourselves. Sound like science fiction? Perhaps. But the architects of this eternity are already laying its foundation. Projects like the Human Connectome Project are already mapping neural pathways. Moore's law, though slowing, continues to increase computing power exponentially. Neural interfaces allow us to increasingly accurately read and even stimulate brain activity. Futurists like Ray Kurzweil predict that the technological singularity, the moment when artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence, will make mind uploading not just possible, but inevitable. For them, this is the next logical step in our evolution. But here, on the threshold of a man-made paradise, the deepest ethical and philosophical chasms await us. Let's ask the fundamental question. That digital copy that wakes up on the server, will it really be you? Or will it simply be a perfect clone, a digital ghost that possesses all your memories and believes itself to be you, while your true consciousness fades forever with your last heartbeat? This is the ship of Theseus paradox at its most terrifying. If you replace one plank in a ship, it's still the same ship. But what if you replace all of them? The copy of your consciousness will claim to be you, but will it possess the same uninterrupted flow of self-awareness that you feel right now? Or will the original consciousness simply be interrupted
at the moment of copying. And this is only the first of the problems.
Who will own the servers that store your eternal life? Corporations? Governments? What if your digital paradise can be hacked, infected with a virus, or simply shut down for non-payment? What if someone decides to create a digital hell for you, a simulation of endless suffering, eternity without the right to oblivion, without the possibility of truly dying, may not be a gift, but the most terrible curse. So we hold in our hands a third map leading to paradise. It is written not in the ink of prophets or the formulas of quantum mechanics, but in binary code. It promises not just life after death, but life without death itself. But the price of entry into this digital Eden may be too high. Perhaps we will have to pay with our souls, leaving behind the very concept of humanity. And here we are, in the very heart of the labyrinth where all our paths converge. We've descended into the biochemical depths of a dying brain, ascended to the cold stars of quantum physics, and peered into the shimmering abyss of a digital future. And each path has led us to its own paradise. Now, they collide. In one corner of the ring stands an elegant theory, almost ruthless in its simplicity: neuroscience. It looks at all the evidence, all the rapturous stories of those who have returned from the dead, and says, this is theater, a grand farewell performance that the brain stages for itself. That tunnel of light, it's just a narrowing field of vision due to oxygen starvation, hypoxia, a feeling of boundless bliss and love, a cocktail of endorphins and neurotransmitters, the body's last desperate attempt to numb its own demise. Meetings with deceased relatives, activation of deep memory zones, flashes of familiar images before eternal fading. From a neuroscience perspective, paradise is the most convincing hallucination of all, a perfect simulation born of panic and the fading of the flesh. It is not out there. It is here, in the last sparks of your neurons' activity. And when the last spark fades, the show ends. Simple, logical, and scary. But from another corner comes a quiet but insistent voice. The voice of a witness who shouldn't be there. The voice of quantum physics. It asks, how can we explain facts that go beyond mere theater? How can a patient with a completely stopped heart and a flat electroencephalogram, that is, with a brain that is officially silent, describe in detail a unique surgical instrument the doctor retrieved from another part of the operating room? How can he recount the nurse's conversation when his brain is incapable of registering even sound? The theater theory breaks down here. And then hypotheses like the one proposed by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff enter the picture. What if consciousness is more than just a product of neurons? What if it is something more fundamental? Quantum information, woven into the very fabric of reality, and only temporarily living in our brain, in its microtubules. At the moment of death, this information is not erased. It is simply released, flows back into the universal ocean from which it once came. In this picture of the world, paradise is not an illusion. It is a return home. A state in which our I exists outside of our biological shell, as pure information, as a fundamental property of the universe. Not a place, but a state of being.
And while these two titans, biology and physics, conduct their eternal dispute, a third player enters the field. He doesn't look into the brain or into the depths of space. He stares at a monitor screen. This is the cold and pragmatic mind of an engineer futurologist. He listens to this debate and only smirks. Why seek paradise if you can build it? Why guess what happens to consciousness after death if you can simply prevent it from dying? Forget biochemistry and quantum fields. The future belongs to silicon. Paradise is a super-powerful server. Immortality is a perfectly replicated structure of your brain, uploaded to a virtual reality, where there is no pain, old age, or limitations. A man-made Eden, where you can live forever as a digital avatar. This theory doesn't care about the unexplained facts of NDEs, and it's indifferent to near-death hallucinations. It proposes not searching, but creating, not hoping, but programming. And in this race for eternity, it may just outpace everyone. So, what do we have? 3 maps leading in completely different directions. One points inside our skull, another into the fabric of the universe itself, a third into the cold heart of a machine. Which one is correct? And here we come to the most mind-boggling idea of all, the observer paradox. This principle comes from quantum physics, where the very act of observing a particle changes its behavior. But what if the same is true for consciousness? What if heaven isn't an objective place to be found and mapped? What if it's a phenomenon born at the intersection of consciousness and reality, at the moment of their ultimate tension? Perhaps the answer depends on the observer. For a brain composed of neurons, the transition into oblivion feels like a biochemical storm. For consciousness, which may be quantum in nature, this same process feels like liberation. And for a civilization capable of digitizing the mind, it's simply a technical task of transferring data. 3 different observers, 3 different heavens. Perhaps we're asking the wrong question? We're asking, where is heaven? As if it were a city or a galaxy. But what if the right question is, what is heaven? And the answer isn't just one. It changes depending on who's looking. It's not a territory. It's a mirror into which consciousness gazes on the threshold of eternity. And what it sees there may be something it creates itself. So we stand at the finish line of our long journey. We've descended into the blood vessels of a dying brain, peered into the icy void of space, and even touched the shimmering code of future digital worlds. And after all this, the ultimate question remains hanging in the air, like the last unsolved riddle of the universe. So where are the coordinates of heaven? If you're expecting a simple answer, a single destination on our scientific map, then I must disappoint you. Modern science doesn't provide such an answer. But what it offers instead is far more interesting. It doesn't hand us a ready-made map.
It gives us a whole atlas of several completely different, but in their own way amazing models of reality. The first map is the most pragmatic, and for some, perhaps the most brutal. It's the neuroscientist's map. In it, heaven is just a dot in our own skull, a bright but fleeting flash in the theater of the dying brain. A grand farewell show staged by nature itself. In this model, there is no journey.
There are only biochemical fireworks. Hypoxia flooding the visual cortex with light. Endorphins providing a feeling of absolute bliss. And psychoactive substances like DMT that the brain itself produces in its final moments, opening the floodgates for reunions with those we loved. It's an elegant and, in its own way, ruthless explanation. It tells us that there is no there. All that exists is here, within us. And this here simply fades away, putting on an unforgettable final performance. But the moment we accept this version, a witness who should not have been emerges from the shadows.
The patient who, while clinically dead, with a direct line on the electroencephalograph, saw and heard things he should never have seen or heard. And here science unfolds a second card, the card of the quantum physicist. This card is far stranger and more captivating. In this model, paradise isn't a place at all. It's a fundamental level of reality. According to the hypotheses of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, our consciousness isn't simply the product of neurons. It's quantum information, a kind of cosmic software that our brain uses like a biological computer. And at the moment of physical death, when the hardware fails, this information isn't erased. It's simply released, returning to the ocean of universal consciousness. In this model, paradise is a state in which our I exists outside the body, as pure information, possibly capable of eternally resonating with the structures of the universe. Not a journey of the soul to heaven, but the return of quantum data to the source code of the universe. And finally, the third map. It's being drawn not by biologists or physicists, but by engineers and futurologists. This isn't a map of an existing territory. Rather, it's an architectural plan. A plan for building paradise. If the universe hasn't provided eternal life for our consciousness, then we will create it ourselves. This model posits that heaven is something we can build. It's a super powerful computer simulation, a digital Eden into which we can one day upload our consciousness, our mind, our memories, to live forever as a digital avatar in an ideal, suffering-free world. A world without disease, without loss, without death itself. It's a cold, calculating, yet incredibly ambitious project. Heaven not as a gift, but as a technology. So, what do we have in the end? A biochemical illusion, a fundamental property of the universe, or a future technological reality? Three very different answers, and none definitive. The coordinates have not been found. But perhaps the greatest value of our search is not in finding a point on the map, but in the fact that this search itself has forced us to expand that map to the limits of the imaginable. In an attempt to understand what awaits us beyond the final frontier, science has been forced to ask itself the deepest questions. What is consciousness? What is reality? What does it even mean to exist? The journey to discover the scientific coordinates of paradise turned into an incredible adventure, an exploration of the very nature of existence. We didn't receive a comforting answer, but we received something more, an understanding of the complexity, multifaceted and wondrous nature of the universe and our place in it. The search continues. And perhaps the next step in this search will force us to look in a completely different direction. Regardless of whether paradise is a product of neurochemistry, quantum physics, or future technologies, the very human desire for it speaks to the fundamental nature of our consciousness.
the desire to overcome entropy and chaos. The final shot, a gaze into the starry sky, or the complexity of a neural network. We pose a rhetorical question to the viewer. What if the universe we seek somewhere out there is actually within us?